London, June 18, 1982. A man is found hanging from the scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge at first light. His name is Roberto Calvi. He is 62 years old. He is the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, the largest private bank in Italy, headquartered in Milan, with subsidiary operations across 9 countries on 3 continents. His pockets contain bricks, approximately 12 pounds of construction material, distributed between his jacket and his trousers, with the kind of deliberate weight distribution that suggests a specific purpose rather than a random accumulation. His jacket also contains approximately $15,000 in cash, divided among British pounds, Swiss francs, and Italian lire. The City of London police conclude suicide. The verdict will not hold. It will take 20 years, 2 inquests, 1 Italian criminal trial, and the testimony of a mafia informant before the true nature of what happened under Blackfriars Bridge begins to take a legally documented shape. By then, the institution at the center of what Roberto Calvi had built, and what Roberto Calvi knew, will have paid out $244 million in a settlement it described as a voluntary recognition of moral responsibility. It admitted nothing. It always admits nothing. This is the story of the Vatican Bank, and it makes the Italian mafia look like a provincial operation. The Istituto per le Opere di Religione was established in its modern form by Pope Pius XII in June 1942. The name translates approximately as the Institute for Religious Works. It is known publicly and in every serious financial and law enforcement context as the Vatican Bank. Neither name captures what it actually is. It is not a bank in any sense that the international regulatory framework governing modern financial institutions recognizes. It does not accept deposits from the general public. It does not extend commercial credit. It does not file reports with any central bank, because no central bank has jurisdiction over it. It does not submit to external audit, because no external auditor has the legal authority to demand access to its records. It operates inside the sovereign territory of Vatican City, 44 square kilometers enclosed within the city of Rome, recognized under the Lateran Treaty of 1929 as an independent sovereign state. And that sovereignty is the foundational fact from which every other operational characteristic of the institution follows. Vatican City is not Italy. Its financial institutions are not subject to Italian banking law, Italian tax law, or the reporting requirements of the Bank of Italy. It is not a member of the European Union and is not subject to EU financial directives. It has not signed the international anti-money laundering conventions that govern the financial institutions of virtually every other sovereign entity in the Western world. When Italian magistrates investigating financial crimes have sought information from the Vatican Bank about transactions involving Italian citizens and Italian financial institutions, the Vatican has responded consistently across decades, and regardless of the political sensitivity of the specific case, by asserting its sovereign immunity and declining to provide the information requested. This legal architecture was not built to facilitate crime. It was built to protect the Church's financial operations from the political interference of hostile governments, specifically the Italian government, whose relationship with the Holy See through the late 19th and early 20th centuries had been characterized by mutual suspicion, territorial conflict, and the periodic threat of asset seizure. The Lateran Treaty resolved the territorial dispute and established Vatican sovereignty, but it did not eliminate the Church's institutional instinct to maintain financial structures that no outside government could reach. The operational consequence of that architecture, however, was the creation of a financial institution with the following characteristics. It could receive funds from any source, in any currency, without reporting those funds to any regulatory authority. It could transfer funds to any destination through the international banking system, using its own institutional identity. It could maintain accounts for individuals and organizations whose identities it was not required to disclose to any external investigator. It could conduct foreign exchange transactions, securities purchases, and real estate investments across international markets without the reporting obligations that governed every other participant in those markets. The men who eventually discovered what this architecture could be used for were not its architects. They were opportunists, a Sicilian banker, a Chicago priest, and a Milanese financier who looked at a sovereign institution operating entirely without regulatory accountability and recognized it as the most useful financial instrument they had ever encountered. What they built inside it over the course of 2 decades was a criminal financial system that processed hundreds of millions of dollars in mafia money, facilitated the largest bank fraud in Italian history, connected the Holy See to a secret Masonic lodge, whose membership included the leadership of every Italian institution that was supposed to be investigating exactly this kind of activity, and produced at least 2 confirmed murders and 1 death whose circumstances have never been satisfactorily explained. The Vatican Bank did not create these men, but it created the conditions in which what they were capable of could operate without effective constraint. The absence of oversight was the product. Everything else followed from it. Paul Casimir Marcinkus was born on January 15, 1922, in Cicero, Illinois. His father, Michaelis Marcinkus, was a Lithuanian immigrant who had come to the United States in the early years of the century and supported his family by washing windows. The family was Catholic, working class, and resident in a suburb whose most prominent citizen, in the years of Paul Marcinkus's childhood, was Al Capone. Cicero in the 1920s and early 1930s was not simply a place where Al Capone happened to live. It was a place that Capone had systematically purchased. The municipal government, the police department, the electoral apparatus, and run as an adjunct to his Chicago operations after Mayor William Dever's reform administration pushed his most visible activities out of the city proper. The Four Deuces, Capone's headquarters on South Wabash Avenue in Chicago, had its operational equivalent in the Hawthorne Inn on 22nd Street in Cicero, where Capone conducted business, entertained associates, and maintained the kind of civic relationships that ensured his operations were not disturbed by the local authorities his organization effectively controlled. The parallel between the environment of Marcinkus's childhood and the institution he would eventually run is not a moral argument. It is a biographical observation. A man who grew up in a town where the most powerful figure operated a criminal enterprise behind an impenetrable institutional facade, and where the civic and law enforcement structures that were supposed to constrain that enterprise were instead its instruments, had experienced, at a formative age and in his immediate social environment, a working demonstration of how institutional power and criminal operation can coexist within a single organizational structure without contradiction. Marcinkus was ordained a Catholic priest in 1947, at the age of 25. He studied canon law in Rome at the Gregorian University and subsequently took a position in the Vatican Secretariat of State, diplomatic and administrative arm of the Holy See. He was competent, ambitious, and possessed of a physical presence that distinguished him from the typical curial official. At 6 feet 3 and approximately 210 pounds, Marcinkus was described by colleagues and observers consistently as a man who occupied space differently from other clerics, less contemplative, more operational, more comfortable with the practical management of situations than with the theological or liturgical dimensions of ecclesiastical life. He was, in the language of institutional typology, an operator, a fixer, a man who solved logistical problems and managed difficult situations for more senior officials who valued his capacity for practical action. His specific utility was demonstrated during the international travels of Pope Paul VI. The modern papacy's engagement with international travel. Paul VI was the first pope in more than a century to travel extensively outside Italy, created security and logistical challenges that the Vatican's existing administrative apparatus was not equipped to manage. Marcinkus attached himself to these operations and proved exceptionally capable at the specific combination of advanced planning, crowd management, and the handling of the countless practical problems that accompany a head of state's movements through foreign countries. He became, in effect, the Pope's advance man and personal security coordinator, a role he performed with enough competence and discretion that he accumulated the kind of personal trust from Paul VI that is the most durable currency in any hierarchical institution. The assignment to the Vatican Bank came in 1971. Paul VI appointed Marcinkus as president of the IOR, the effective operational head of the institution, reporting directly to a commission of 5 cardinals who provided nominal oversight, but whose engagement with the bank's actual operations was, in practice, limited to receiving the reports that Marcinkus chose to provide them. The appointment was not the product of any financial expertise Marcinkus possessed. He had none in any formal sense. It was the product of personal loyalty. The Pope's confidence that the man who had managed his personal security could be trusted to manage an institution whose operations required absolute discretion and whose activities could not be disclosed to external scrutiny. Marcinkus understood his appointment in exactly those terms. He was not being asked to run a bank in the professional sense. He was being asked to manage a financial sovereign entity on behalf of an institution that needed its financial operations to remain private, and to do so with the loyalty and discretion that his role as the Pope's personal fixer had demonstrated he possessed. The financial sophistication required for this task was not the sophistication of commercial banking or investment management. It was the sophistication of a man who understood that the institution's most valuable characteristic was its opacity, and who was prepared to defend and exploit that opacity with the same practical effectiveness he had brought to managing papal travel logistics. He gave his operational philosophy in a single sentence that has been quoted in every serious account of his tenure at the IOR. When a journalist asked him about the Vatican Bank's financial activities, Marcinkus replied, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." It was a line that revealed, with more clarity than he perhaps intended, exactly how he understood his role. The Vatican Bank was not a spiritual institution with financial operations. It was a financial operation conducted under spiritual cover. The distinction was not semantic. It was operational. It determined every decision he made for the next 18 years. The first significant decision Marcinkus made, after taking control of the IOR, was to deepen the institution's relationship with Michele Sindona. Sindona had been introduced to Vatican financial operations in the early 1960s through a relationship with the Vatican's chief financial advisor, Massimo Spada, and had managed several significant transactions for the Holy See's investment portfolio with results that the Church's financial administrators considered satisfactory. When Marcinkus arrived at the IOR, he inherited the Sindona relationship and expanded it. He trusted Sindona's financial judgment in the way that a man appointed to a role for which he lacks specific expertise tends to trust the judgment of someone who demonstrates fluent command of the technical dimensions of that role. Sindona was fluent. He was persuasive. He was connected to every significant financial and political network in Italy and to several significant ones in the United States. And he was, as Marcinkus would discover at enormous cost, building an empire on foundations that had already begun to crack. The appointment of Paul Marcinkus to run the Vatican Bank was the hinge point on which everything that followed turned. Not because Marcinkus was uniquely corrupt, though the evidence of what he participated in over the following 18 years is extensive and specific, but because the combination of his particular personality, loyal, practical, institutionally defensive, comfortable with opacity, and the particular institution he was given to manage, sovereign, unaudited, structurally insulated from all external accountability, produced the conditions in which the men who understood what the IOR could be used for found the operational partner they needed. The Sicilian was already waiting. Michele Sindona was born in Patti, a small town on the northern coast of Sicily, in 1920. He studied law in Messina, qualified as a tax attorney, and moved to Milan in the late 1940s, where he built an initial practice advising clients on the specific and complex challenges of Italian tax law in the post-war Reconstruction economy. He was intelligent, precise in the management of legal complexity, and possessed of a social fluency that allowed him to move between the professional and business classes of post-war Milan with the ease of a man who had always belonged there, which he had not. Sicily was not Milan. The distance between the two was not merely geographic. It was the distance between the periphery and the center of Italian economic life, and Sindona had crossed it by an act of sustained personal reinvention that required both the competence to perform at the center's level and the discretion to ensure that the relationships that had supported his ascent were not visible to the people he was ascending toward. The relationships were specific. Sindona's initial legal practice in Milan brought him into contact with the Sicilian mafia's northern Italian business operations, the financial infrastructure that the organization's leadership maintained in Milan, Turin, and other northern cities to manage the proceeds of its criminal activities in forms that could circulate through the legitimate economy. His tax expertise made him useful to men who had money they could not explain and who needed someone who understood the legal mechanics of making unexplained money appear ordinary. He provided that service. The men who paid for it were not ordinary clients. They were members of the Gambino crime family and their Italian affiliates, men whose financial interests in Italy required exactly the kind of legal and financial management that Sindona could provide, and whose capacity for violence provided, in turn, a form of institutional protection for Sindona's operations that no ordinary professional relationship could have offered. The CIA relationship developed through a different channel, but served a compatible purpose. The United States government's intense concern about communist electoral strength in post-war Italy. The Italian Communist Party was the largest in Western Europe and a consistent electoral force, translated into covert financial support for anti-communist political operations that required conduits outside the official, diplomatic and financial channels. Sindona became one of those conduits. The specific operational details of the CIA's use of Sindona's financial network were never publicly established in full, but the general character of the relationship was confirmed in later investigations. Sindona moved money for American intelligence in Italy in ways that required exactly the kind of financial opacity and cross-jurisdictional operation that his network was structured to provide. By the early 1960s, Sindona controlled a financial empire of substantial complexity. He had acquired controlling interests in multiple Italian banks, in real estate operations across Italy and the United States, and in a network of offshore holding companies headquartered in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas that provided the structural architecture for moving money across jurisdictions without leaving the documentary trail that would have made those movements legible to any regulatory authority that happened to examine them. The offshore structure was the key operational element. Money flowing through the offshore companies changed character as it moved. The ownership of the receiving entity, the legal description of the transaction, the apparent purpose of the transfer, in ways that made tracing its origin from the other end of the transaction essentially impossible for investigators working within the constraints of normal banking regulation. The Vatican connection was his most valuable asset, and he understood it as such with precise clarity. The IOR's sovereign status made it the ideal terminus for money moving through his offshore network. A transaction that ended at the Vatican Bank ended, from a regulatory perspective, at a wall. Italian investigators had no authority to ask what had arrived there or what had left. The money that went into the IOR went, from the Italian financial regulatory system's perspective, into a black box from which no official could demand an accounting. Sindona managed the Vatican's investment portfolio through his financial network and produced returns that satisfied the Church's financial administrators sufficiently to ensure the relationship's continuation. The returns were real. The investments were real. But the operational value of the relationship to Sindona's criminal financial network was not the returns it generated for the Vatican. It was the institutional credibility that the Vatican Association provided to every other part of his operation. A banker with Vatican connections, in Catholic Italy in the 1960s, occupied a social and institutional position that conferred a degree of respectability, insulating his other activities from the scrutiny they would otherwise have attracted. The mafia money, the CIA money, the offshore network, all of it operated more comfortably in the shadow of the white cross on his letterhead. The collapse came from the United States. In 1974, Sindona's American operations began to unravel as a result of foreign exchange speculation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Franklin National Bank, a Long Island institution that Sindona had acquired in 1972, and that had, under his ownership, made foreign exchange bets of a scale and recklessness that its capital base could not sustain, failed in October 1974. It was, at the time, the largest bank failure in American history. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation took over. The investigation that followed exposed the foreign exchange losses, the misrepresentation of the bank's financial condition to regulators, and the connections between Franklin National and the broader Sindona network. The Italian investigations that followed the American collapse began to trace the connections between Sindona's Italian banking operations, his offshore holding companies, and the Vatican Bank. What they found, in the fragmentary form that investigations working around the edges of Vatican sovereignty could establish, was evidence of transactions flowing through IOR accounts that did not correspond to any legitimate financial purpose the Church could credibly claim to be conducting. Marcinkus's response to the Sindona collapse was the response of a man managing an institutional exposure problem, rather than a man confronting the moral dimensions of what he had participated in. He cooperated with the cleanup operations, the restructuring of Vatican-connected financial positions to minimize the visible damage, and he distanced himself, publicly and in his dealings with Vatican officials, from Sindona's personal financial activities while maintaining the operational relationships within the network that the Sindona connection had established. The offshore structure survived the Sindona collapse, the IOR's role within it survived, and the man who would take Sindona's operational position within the network, who would become Marcinkus's new primary partner in the management of what the Vatican Bank had become, was already in position. Roberto Calvi was waiting. On March 17, 1981, officers from the Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial police, raided the Villa Wanda in Arezzo, the Tuscan property of a 72-year-old former fascist operative named Licio Gelli. They were looking for evidence related to Gelli's financial activities. What they found changed the political history of the Italian Republic. Among the documents seized at Villa Wanda was a membership list. It contained 962 names. The list identified the members of an organization called Propaganda Due, P2, a secret Masonic lodge whose existence had been known to Italian intelligence services for several years, but whose full membership had not previously been established. The names on the list were not names of men who could be described, by any reasonable standard, as marginal figures in Italian institutional life. The list included 3 current members of the Italian cabinet. It included 40 sitting members of parliament. It included 43 generals of the Carabinieri and the Italian army. It included 8 admirals of the Italian Navy. It included the heads of all 3 of Italy's civilian and military intelligence services. It included magistrates, prosecutors, senior police officials, newspaper editors, television executives, and industrialists. It included Roberto Calvi, the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, who was then in the process of building, with Vatican Bank participation, the financial structure that would become the largest bank fraud in Italian history. The publication of the P2 membership list produced, in Italy, something approaching a constitutional crisis. The Prime Minister at the time, Arnaldo Forlani, resigned. Parliament established a commission of inquiry. The heads of the intelligence services named on the list were removed. The revelations confirmed, in documentary form, what Italian investigative journalists and a handful of magistrates had been suggesting for years, that, beneath the formal institutional structure of the Italian Republic, a parallel network of mutual protection and coordinated influence had been operating, connecting men in positions of authority across every institution that was supposed to provide accountability over every other institution. Licio Gelli had been recruited into Freemasonry in the 1960s and had, through a combination of personal cultivation and the specific appeal of an organization that promised its members access to a network of powerful men operating outside normal institutional channels, built P2 into the most influential private network in Italian public life. His method was not ideological in any coherent sense. Gelli was a pragmatist whose fascist background was less a political commitment than a cultural style, the residue of the specific Italian environment in which he had come of age. His method was the method of the fixer. He accumulated information about the people he recruited, provided them with services they needed and could not obtain through official channels, and in return received the loyalty and the operational cooperation of men who were in positions to be useful to him and to each other. The services P2 provided to its members were specific and practical. Access to other P2 members across institutional boundaries, a general who needed a favor from a magistrate, a politician who needed a favor from a bank executive, without the formality and the documentary trail that official channels required. Advance information about regulatory investigations, prosecutorial decisions, and political developments that affected the financial or professional interests of P2 members, and most critically, coordinated protection against external investigations that threatened any member of the network, protection provided through the membership's collective occupation of the institutional positions that such investigations would have to pass through. Roberto Calvi's membership in P2 was not a peripheral biographical detail. It was the operational explanation for why Banco Ambrosiano's relationship with the Vatican Bank was able to develop to the scale it reached before any Italian regulatory authority intervened. The Bank of Italy, Italy's bank and primary banking regulator, had been examining Banco Ambrosiano's foreign operations with increasing concern since the late 1970s. The examination had identified transactions that did not have credible explanations within normal commercial banking operations. The examination had been slowed, complicated, and periodically redirected by interventions that the subsequent P2 investigation established had come from within the regulatory and political apparatus itself, from men who were on Gelli's list and whose presence in the institutions responsible for the investigation ensured that the investigation proceeded at a pace and with a thoroughness calibrated to protect Calvi's operations rather than to expose them. The P2 network's relationship with the Vatican Bank was not a formal institutional connection. The IOR was not a P2 member organization, but the network's practical utility to the Vatican financial operations was substantial. P2 members, in positions of political and regulatory authority, provided the buffer that allowed the Vatican Bank to conduct its operations with the Italian financial system without the regulatory scrutiny that those operations would otherwise have attracted. The sovereign immunity of the Vatican was the legal firewall. P2 was the political firewall. Together, they created an environment in which the financial structure that Marcinkus and Calvi were building could operate without effective constraint for longer than it should have been structurally possible. The organizational logic of P2 applied to the Vatican Bank situation illustrates something important about how institutional corruption of this scale operates. It does not require explicit coordination of specific criminal acts by all members of the network simultaneously. It requires only that men in key institutional positions share a disposition, produced by their membership, their relationships, their mutual obligations toward protecting the network's interests when those interests and their official duties come into conflict. The Bank of Italy examiner who slows his report, the magistrate who accepts a procedural challenge that delays an investigation, the politician who raises a jurisdictional question that redirects prosecutorial attention. None of these individual acts requires the actor to understand the full scope of what he is protecting. Each act, in isolation, can be rationalized within the normal range of institutional discretion. The corruption is produced by the aggregate of individually rationalizable decisions, coordinated not by explicit instruction, but by shared membership in a network whose interests each member has internalized as their own. This is precisely the operational pattern the subsequent investigation of the Banco Ambrosiano collapse revealed. No single act of obstruction was decisive. No single P2 member made a decision that, standing alone, could be characterized as the protection of a criminal operation. The protection was structural. It was produced by the network's architecture rather than by any individual's decision. And when the network was exposed by the Villa Wanda raid, the protection evaporated, not because the individual members became less disposed to protect their interests, but because the exposure of the membership list made the exercise of that protection visible in a way that created its own institutional risks. By March 1981, when Gelli's files were seized, Roberto Calvi was running out of time. The Bank of Italy's examination had found enough to refer the matter to prosecutors. Calvi had been convicted in 1981 of currency export violations and had received a suspended sentence that was under appeal. The Vatican Bank's accounts were connected to a chain of offshore transactions that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain, and the men who were supposed to be protecting him, the P2 network, the political relationships, the coordinated institutional buffer, were now managing their own exposure rather than his. In the summer of 1982, the structure collapsed, and when it did, it took with it the banking system's largest private institution, the reputations of the men who had enabled it, and the life of the man at its center. But before Calvi, there was another death, one that happened 4 years earlier, and one that the Vatican has never satisfactorily explained. Pope Paul VI died on August 6, 1978, at the age of 80, at the papal summer residence in Castel Gandolfo. His successor, Albino Luciani, who took the name John Paul I, was elected on August 26, 1978, on the fourth ballot of the conclave. He was 65 years old. He was the Patriarch of Venice. He had a reputation for pastoral simplicity, theological moderation, and personal warmth that stood in deliberate contrast to the more formal institutional style of his predecessor. He smiled. He was photographed smiling. The Italian press called him Il Papa del Sorriso, the smiling Pope. He was dead 33 days after his election. The official account of John Paul I's death, as released by the Vatican on the morning of September 29, 1978, was that he had been found dead in his bed at approximately 5:30 in the morning by his personal secretary, who had gone to wake him for morning prayer. The cause of death was given as myocardial infarction, a heart attack. He had appeared in good health the previous evening. He had no known history of cardiac disease. He was 65 years old. The Vatican did not perform an autopsy. This decision, taken immediately, within hours of the discovery of the body, and maintained, despite the subsequent controversy it generated, was explained by Vatican officials as consistent with the wishes of the papal household and with Italian law as it applied to the sovereign territory of Vatican City. The explanation was technically defensible. It was also the decision most calculated to ensure that no independent forensic examination of the circumstances of the death would ever be possible. The specific details that emerged in subsequent days and weeks deepened rather than resolved the questions surrounding the death. The body had been found holding documents, specifically papers that subsequent investigation identified as connected to John Paul I's intended review of the Vatican Bank's operations and personnel. The Pope had, in the weeks since his election, received briefings on the IOR's activities from sources within the Vatican's financial administration who were concerned about what the bank had been doing under Marcinkus's management. He had reportedly expressed his intention to remove Marcinkus from the presidency of the IOR. He had also been briefed on the names of individuals connected to P2 who held positions within the Vatican hierarchy, positions whose holders had reason to be concerned about a pope who was both asking questions about the bank and known to be considering personnel changes. The list of concerns he had reportedly been reviewing at the time of his death was found in his hands on the morning of September 29. It was removed by the papal household before the arrival of any official who might have preserved it as evidence of anything. None of this constitutes proof of murder. The Vatican's position that John Paul I died of natural causes, that an autopsy was not required and would not have been appropriate, and that the questions raised by investigators and journalists represent speculation rather than evidence, is a position that cannot be definitively refuted on the basis of the available evidence. A 65-year-old man can die of a heart attack in his sleep. The absence of autopsy means the cause of death cannot be established with medical certainty, which cuts in both directions. It neither confirms nor eliminates the natural causes explanation. What can be established is the following. John Paul I had expressed an intention to investigate and restructure the Vatican Bank's operations. The men most directly threatened by such an investigation were Marcinkus, whose removal the Pope had reportedly decided upon, and the broader network of individuals whose financial activities depended on the IOR's continued operation in its existing form. The Pope died 33 days after his election, before he could implement any of the changes he had indicated he intended to make. No autopsy was performed. The papers he had been reviewing were removed from the scene, and his successor, Pope John Paul II, elected 6 years later, did not remove Marcinkus from the Vatican Bank. Marcinkus remained as president of the IOR for another 11 years. The investigation conducted by the journalist David Yallop, published in 1984 as In God's Name, argued for murder on the basis of these circumstantial connections. The Vatican rejected the argument and has continued to reject it. The cause of John Paul I's death has not been officially re-examined by any independent authority. What the death of John Paul I established, regardless of its cause, was the operational continuity of the financial structure that Marcinkus, Sindona and Calvi had built. If the Pope had intended to dismantle it, that intention died with him. His successor inherited a Vatican Bank still under Marcinkus's control, still embedded in the Calvi network, and still operating within the P2 protective architecture. Whatever John Paul I had known, or had been about to do, was buried with him in the crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The machine kept running. Roberto Calvi was born in Milan on April 13, 1920. He studied at Bocconi University, worked briefly at a Milanese bank after the war, and joined Banco Ambrosiano in 1947 as a junior employee. He rose through the institution steadily, without the kind of dramatic acceleration that marks visibly ambitious men, and became its general manager in 1971 and its chairman in 1975. By the time he assumed the chairmanship, he had already begun constructing the relationship with the Vatican Bank that would define his career and determine his death. Banco Ambrosiano's name was not incidental. It was named for Saint Ambrose, the 4th century bishop of Milan, and it had been founded in 1896 specifically as a Catholic bank, an institution whose shareholder structure was designed to exclude non-Catholics and whose lending practices were explicitly connected to the Catholic business community of Lombardy. By the 1970s, the formal religious character of the bank's operations had faded, but the Vatican connection remained structurally significant. The IOR was a shareholder in Banco Ambrosiano. This relationship, the Vatican Bank as a shareholder in a private Italian bank, was the foundation on which everything Calvi subsequently built was constructed. The financial structure that Calvi developed in partnership with Marcinkus was a work of considerable technical sophistication. At its core was a network of offshore holding companies incorporated in Luxembourg, Panama, the Bahamas, and other jurisdictions chosen for their combination of financial privacy and legal credibility. These companies were, in the formal sense, independent legal entities. In the operational sense, they were instruments, vehicles through which money could be moved, transformed, and redeployed in ways that obscured its origin and destination from any regulatory authority attempting to trace its path. The Vatican Bank's role in this structure was specific and essential. The IOR provided letters of comfort, documents attesting that the Vatican Bank stood behind the financial obligations of specific entities within the offshore network. These letters were not formal guarantees in the legal sense that would have appeared on the Vatican's balance sheet. They were representations, assurances provided on Vatican Bank letterhead, carrying the institutional authority of the Holy See, that told the counterparties of the offshore companies that their financial exposure was underwritten by an institution whose sovereign status and institutional credibility placed it beyond ordinary credit risk assessment. The offshore companies could borrow money, enter into financial commitments, and conduct transactions on the basis of those letters that they could not have conducted on the basis of their own financial standing, which was in most cases minimal to non-existent. The money that moved through this structure had multiple sources. A portion came from the Vatican's own investment operations, funds the IOR was managing for institutional purposes that were directed through the offshore network in ways that produced returns the Church's financial administrators received without needing to know the specifics of how those returns were generated. A portion came from Banco Ambrosiano's institutional lending, loans made to offshore entities that then deployed the funds in ways Calvi directed, with the understanding that repayment would be managed through the network's internal transfer mechanisms rather than through conventional commercial repayment, and a portion that became, in the subsequent investigations, the most legally significant and the most personally dangerous to the men who had moved it, came from the Italian mafia. The mafia's need for the Vatican Bank's services was the straightforward need of any criminal organization generating large cash revenues in a form that cannot be directly deployed in the legitimate economy. The proceeds of drug trafficking, extortion, and other criminal operations accumulate in cash, physical currency that cannot be deposited in a bank account without explanation, cannot be invested in legitimate assets without documentation, and cannot be transferred across borders without triggering the reporting mechanisms that convert unexplained cash into a law enforcement investigation. The process of converting criminal cash into money that appears to have a legitimate origin is money laundering, and it requires access to financial infrastructure capable of absorbing the cash, processing it through a sufficient number of transactions to obscure its origin, and returning it in a form that can circulate in the legitimate economy without attracting attention. The Vatican Bank, operating without regulatory reporting requirements and with the institutional cover of sovereign status, was the most efficient money laundering infrastructure available to Italian organized crime in the 1970s and early 1980s. Cash moved into the IOR through mechanisms that the subsequent investigations traced with varying degrees of specificity, through currency exchange transactions, through purchases of financial instruments, through the network of intermediaries who provided the operational connection between the mafia's cash generation and the Vatican's financial absorption. Once inside the IOR, the money was transformed through the offshore network, through Banco Ambrosiano's lending operations, through the chain of intercompany transactions that Calvi's structure had been designed to make untraceable, into financial instruments that could be returned to circulation, in forms that bore no visible connection to their criminal origin. The scale of these operations was not marginal. The subsequent investigation of Banco Ambrosiano's collapse identified a hole in the bank's balance sheet of approximately $1.3 billion. The specific composition of that hole, the specific transactions that produced it, was never fully established in any legal proceeding, in part because the Vatican Bank declined to provide the information that would have made a complete accounting possible. What was established was that a substantial portion of the missing funds had moved through the IOR and through the offshore network, and that the Vatican Bank held letters of comfort for offshore entities whose liabilities amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars that they could not repay from any identifiable asset base. Italian investigators called Calvi God's banker. It was a name the press adopted, and that captured with more accuracy than the investigators perhaps intended the precise nature of his operational position. He was not God's banker in the sense of a man who served the Church's financial interests with piety and competence. He was God's banker in the sense of a man who used the institutional authority and the sovereign protection of the world's oldest religious institution as the central element of a financial fraud that had no precedent in Italian banking history. The God in the title was not the God of Catholic theology. It was the God of institutional authority. The sovereign immunity that made the Vatican Bank's involvement in his operations the factor that transformed a complex but manageable financial crime into something that no Italian regulatory or judicial authority could effectively reach. By 1981, the reach was beginning to shorten. The Bank of Italy's examination had produced findings that prosecutors could no longer ignore. The P2 exposure had removed the political buffer. Calvi's currency export conviction and suspended sentence were under appeal, but the underlying investigation had not stopped. It had expanded, and the offshore structure was beginning to show the structural stress of a financial system that had been sustaining itself through internal transfers and new borrowing, rather than through the generation of genuine economic returns. The letters of comfort were coming due. The offshore company's liabilities were producing demands that the network's internal resources could not meet. The $1.3 billion hole was not a sudden catastrophe. It was the accumulated result of years of financial operations that had never been designed to sustain themselves from genuine economic activity. Operations designed to move money, to obscure money, to protect money from regulatory visibility, and not to generate the returns that would have been required to make the financial commitments they had created sustainable. Calvi spent the last months of his life attempting to identify a solution, a new financial partner, a restructuring mechanism, a political intervention that would allow the structure to survive long enough for him to find a way out. He approached potential investors. He sought political connections. He communicated with Vatican officials. He communicated with men connected to the organizations whose money had passed through his network and who had their own reasons to want the structure to continue operating. None of it worked. In June 1982, with Banco Ambrosiano's collapse imminent, and with the men who had been protected by his silence now calculating whether his continued existence was more or less dangerous to them than his death, Roberto Calvi fled Milan on a false passport and made his way, through a series of intermediate stops, to London. He arrived in London on June 15, 1982. 3 days later, he was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge. His pockets contained bricks. The scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge spans the Thames at the point where the river curves between the City of London and the South Bank. The bridge was built in 1869 and carries foot and vehicle traffic between the financial district to the north and the Southwark neighbourhood to the south. In June 1982, repair work had attached scaffolding to its underside, a lattice of metal poles and wooden planking extending below the bridge's stone arches to the level of the river at low tide. Roberto Calvi was found hanging from that scaffolding at 7:30 in the morning on June 18, 1982, by a postal worker crossing the bridge on his way to work. He was suspended from a length of orange nylon rope tied to the scaffolding, his feet submerged in the river at low tide. He was wearing his business suit. His jacket pockets contained bricks and masonry fragments, later measured at approximately 12 pounds in total weight, distributed between his jacket and trouser pockets. His jacket also contained 4,200 pounds sterling, approximately $10,500 in American currency, and Swiss francs equivalent to approximately $4,000. The City of London police conducted the initial investigation. Their conclusion, delivered with a speed that subsequent investigators would identify as problematic, was that Calvi had committed suicide. The determination was made on the basis of the physical evidence at the scene: the hanging, the rope, the absence of obvious signs of struggle, and the obvious fact of Calvi's personal circumstances. A man whose business empire was collapsing, who was facing criminal prosecution in Italy, who had fled his home country on a false passport, and who had, by any visible measure, reason to choose death over the alternative. The suicide verdict was overturned at a second inquest in 1982, which returned an open verdict, meaning the jury could not determine from the evidence whether the death was suicide, accident, or murder. The question remained formally unresolved for 2 decades. In 2002, Calvi's family commissioned a forensic investigation by a team of American specialists. The investigation's findings were specific and consequential. The position of the rope marks on Calvi's neck was inconsistent with the kind of hanging that would have resulted from a man climbing down the scaffolding and suspending himself. The distribution of bruising and the specific characteristics of the marks left by the rope suggested that Calvi had been dead, or at minimum unconscious, before the rope was attached. The bricks in his pockets, their weight, their distribution, and the absence of any logical purpose they would serve if a man were attempting to make his own hanging more effective, were more consistent with deliberate ballasting of a body after death than with any action Calvi himself would have taken. The Italian investigation that had been running parallel to the British proceedings had, by the early 2000s, assembled a picture of who had been involved in Calvi's movements in London in the days before his death. He had not arrived in London alone. He had been accompanied and assisted by a network of individuals connected to the organizations whose financial interests were most directly threatened by what Calvi knew, and by the prospect of what he might say if his situation became desperate enough to make cooperation with prosecutors his best available option. In 2005, 5 individuals were tried in Rome for Calvi's murder. The defendants included Flavio Carboni, a Sardinian businessman with connections to both P2 and to figures in the Sicilian mafia, along with associates of the Neapolitan Camorra and individuals connected to the financial network that Calvi had been managing. The prosecution argued that Calvi had been killed because the men who had used his network to launder criminal proceeds could not risk his cooperation with Italian investigators, and that the killing had been organized and carried out in London during the days immediately following his arrival. The trial produced acquittals. The prosecution's evidence was found insufficient by the Rome court to support convictions beyond the standard required by Italian law. The defendants were not found innocent. The court's determination was that the evidence did not rise to the level required for conviction, which is a different finding. The murders, and the Italian prosecutors had charged murder, not manslaughter or accident, were not prosecuted to a successful conclusion. The men who had been charged returned to their lives. The specific question of who ordered Roberto Calvi's death has never been answered in any court of law in any jurisdiction. The evidence assembled across 20 years of investigation in Britain and Italy is consistent with the following general account. Calvi was killed by men acting on behalf of the criminal organizations, primarily the Sicilian Mafia and its associated financial networks, whose money had passed through the Vatican Bank structure and whose exposure to investigation increased with every day that Calvi remained alive and potentially cooperative with Italian prosecutors. The specific individuals who planned and carried out the killing have not been identified to the legal standard required for conviction. What the investigation did establish, with sufficient documentary specificity to be treated as historical fact rather than allegation, was the nature of the financial operation at the center of which Calvi had been killed. The Banco Ambrosiano collapse, formalized when the bank was placed under Bank of Italy administration in August 1982, 2 months after Calvi's death, revealed the $1.3 billion hole in the institution's accounts. Italian investigators traced the missing funds through the offshore network. The network led back to the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank maintained its sovereign immunity and declined to provide the information that would have allowed a complete accounting. In 1984, the Vatican signed an agreement with the liquidators of Banco Ambrosiano, under which the Holy See paid $244 million. The agreement described the payment as a voluntary contribution made in recognition of the Vatican Bank's moral involvement in the Banco Ambrosiano affair. The Vatican explicitly did not acknowledge legal liability. It explicitly did not acknowledge that the IOR had participated in the fraud that destroyed Banco Ambrosiano. It described its payment as a moral gesture, a recognition that the institution had been, in some unspecified way, in proximity to events that had caused harm. $244 million is a significant moral gesture. It is a number that reflects, even in the Vatican's carefully constructed legal characterization, the scale of what the IOR had actually done. Paul Marcinkus was not prosecuted in Italy because Italy could not prosecute him. He held Vatican citizenship. He resided in Vatican City. The Italian warrants issued against him in 1987, based on evidence accumulated in the Banco Ambrosiano investigation, could not be served within Vatican territory, and the Vatican declined to surrender him. He remained inside Vatican City for approximately 3 years, during which period the Italian statute of limitations on the charges against him eventually expired. In 1990, the charges were dismissed. He returned to the United States. He lived in Sun City, Arizona, until his death in 2006 at the age of 84. He was never tried. He was never convicted. He never publicly acknowledged any wrongdoing in connection with the Vatican Bank's activities during his tenure. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and the death of Roberto Calvi were the visible events. The structure that produced them, The legal architecture, the institutional relationships, the sovereign protection that allowed the entire operation to function was the story. And that story did not end in 1982. The Vatican Bank continued to operate after the Banco Ambrosiano collapse. Marcinkus continued to run it until 1989. The IOR's sovereign status continued to insulate its operations from the external regulatory scrutiny that the collapse should, by any reasonable institutional logic, have produced, and the broader question of what the Vatican Bank had been doing, not just in the Calvi years, but across the entire post-war period during which it had functioned as a financial sovereign entity operating without oversight, remained, after the immediate crisis had passed, as unexamined as it had been before. The Italian financial and judicial system's engagement with the Vatican Bank's activities across the second half of the 20th century is a study in institutional limitation. The magistrates who investigated Calvi and Sindona were serious, competent, and persistent. Several of them received death threats in the course of their investigations. The evidence they assembled was substantial, and, in the cases where it did not run into the wall of Vatican sovereignty, sufficient to produce significant convictions. Sindona was convicted in the United States in 1980 on 65 counts of fraud, perjury, and misappropriation of bank funds connected to the Franklin National collapse. He was extradited to Italy and convicted of ordering the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli, the court-appointed liquidator of his Italian banking operations, who had been killed in 1979 by an American hitman hired by Sindona and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Vohera prison in March 1986, 2 days after drinking a cup of coffee. The official cause of death was cyanide poisoning. Whether it was administered by Sindona himself or by someone who wanted him permanently unable to provide testimony about the network's operations has never been established. The cyanide in Sindona's coffee, like the bricks in Calvi's pockets, like the 33 days of John Paul I's papacy, exists in the historical record as a fact whose full interpretation has been permanently removed from the reach of any judicial process. The men who could have provided the complete account are dead. The institution that held the records declined to open them. The sovereign immunity that protected Marcinkus protected also the documents and the accounts and the transaction histories that would have made the complete story legible. The Vatican's response to the financial scandals of the 1970s and 1980s went through several formal phases that shared a common operational character. Acknowledgement of the minimum necessary, followed by institutional reform that changed the visible surface of the IOR's operations without fundamentally altering the sovereign structure that had made the underlying activities possible. In 1990, following Marcinkus's departure, the Vatican established a supervisory commission of cardinals to oversee the IOR. The commission provided a layer of formal governance that had not existed during the Marcinkus years. It did not provide external audit, regulatory reporting, or any mechanism for outside investigation of the bank's activities. The IOR remained opaque to the same degree it had always been opaque. The governance improvement was structural in appearance and limited in substance. In 2010, the Bank of Italy froze 23 million euros in Vatican bank accounts held at Italian banks, on the grounds that the Vatican had failed to comply with Italian anti-money laundering notification requirements in connection with 2 specific transfers. The Vatican disputed the legal basis for the action and ultimately recovered the funds after providing documentation. The episode illustrated the continuing tension between Italian regulators attempts to apply anti-money laundering standards to the Vatican's financial operations within Italy, and the Vatican's continuing assertion that its sovereign status limited the obligations it owed to Italian financial regulators. Pope Francis, elected in March 2013, initiated a series of reforms at the IOR that were the most substantive the institution had undergone since its establishment in its modern form. An external review committee was appointed. Several thousand accounts held by non-Vatican entities, accounts whose existence was inconsistent with the IOR's stated mandate to serve the financial needs of the Catholic Church and its institutions, were closed. A Vatican Financial Intelligence Authority was established with a mandate to apply anti-money laundering standards to the Holy See's financial operations and to seek recognition from international financial regulatory bodies. In 2013, the Moneyval Committee of the Council of Europe, which evaluates member states' compliance with anti-money laundering standards, issued an evaluation of the Vatican's financial regulatory framework and found it partially compliant with international standards, with specific deficiencies identified in areas including beneficial ownership transparency and the supervision of financial institutions. The reforms under Francis represented a genuine shift in the Vatican's institutional stance toward financial transparency. They were also, in the view of investigators and analysts who had spent decades examining the IOR's activities, substantially less than what a complete reckoning with the institution's history would require. The accounts of the Marcinkus era were not opened. The transactions of the 1970s and 1980s were not investigated by any external authority with access to the IOR's complete records. The full scope of what passed through the Vatican Bank during the period in which it served as the financial infrastructure for Sindona's network and Calvi's offshore structure, and for the mafia money that both men's operations processed, has never been publicly established. The $244 million payment in 1984 was not a settlement of established liability. It was a resolution of a claim that the Vatican had declined to contest fully, structured in terms that preserved the Holy See's formal position of non-responsibility while providing sufficient financial restitution to close the most immediate legal exposure. The Banco Ambrosiano creditors received partial recovery. The Vatican retained its position that the IOR had not been legally responsible for what had happened. The complete financial accounting, the full tracing of the $1.3 billion hole in Banco Ambrosiano's accounts, was never accomplished because the one institution that held the information necessary to complete it declined to provide that information. The men who lost their savings in Banco Ambrosiano's collapse received a portion of what they had been owed. The men who had used the bank's network to launder criminal proceeds had already recovered their money through the mechanisms Calvi had built for exactly that purpose. The Vatican received its payment of $244 million back across several years through the financial operations of the reformed IOR and the institution itself, its sovereign status intact, its legal immunity uncompromised, its archives closed to any investigator who lacked the permission of the Holy See to examine them. Continued, the Italian Mafia, in its most powerful decades, was an organization that controlled neighborhoods, corrupted local governments, and murdered men who threatened its operations. It was a significant criminal institution. It was also, ultimately, an institution that the Italian state could investigate, prosecute, and partially dismantle through the sustained application of legal and investigative resources. the Falcone and Borsellino prosecutions of the 1980s, and the murders of both magistrates in 1992, organized by the Sicilian Mafia, as an act of institutional self-defense, demonstrated both the Mafia's capacity for violence and the Italian state's capacity to accumulate sufficient evidence to convict its leadership. The Mafia killed Falcone and Borsellino. The Italian state prosecuted the men who killed them and convicted them. The Vatican Bank was never successfully prosecuted. It was never dismantled. It was never subjected to the kind of sustained external investigation that would have produced a complete account of its activities. The men who ran its criminal financial operations during its most corrupt period received various degrees of legal accountability. Sindona was convicted and died in prison. Calvi died under the bridge. Marcinkus was shielded by sovereign immunity and died peacefully in Arizona. But the institution that had made all of their activities possible and that had provided the sovereign structure, without which none of what they built could have been built, faced no accountability of any kind that could be characterized as proportionate to what it had participated in. The difference between the Mafia and the Vatican Syndicate is not primarily the scale of the crime, though the scale was different. It is the architecture of accountability. The Mafia's crimes were conducted by individuals operating within an illegal organization in a sovereign state whose legal system could, in principle and eventually in practice, reach them. The Vatican Bank's crimes were conducted through a sovereign institution that was unreachable by any national legal system, that could decline any investigation by asserting immunity, and that could resolve its most significant legal exposure through a negotiated payment whose terms it controlled. The architecture was the protection, the sovereignty was the crime. The Vatican Bank exists today. It has approximately 5,000 active accounts. Its most recent publicly available annual report indicates total assets of approximately 2.8 billion euros. It is supervised by a commission of cardinals and a lay board of directors, whose appointment the Pope approves. It submits to evaluation by the Vatican's own Financial Intelligence Authority. It has made substantial progress since 2013 toward the international anti-money laundering standards that comparable institutions in comparable sovereign states are required to meet. It has never been independently audited by any external authority not appointed by the Holy See itself. The sovereign structure that Pius XII established in 1942 and that the Lateran Treaty of 1929 underwrote remains intact. The IOR answers to the Pope answers to God. The gap between those two accountabilities, the absolute sovereignty of the Holy See and the absolute sovereignty of the divine, is the space in which everything this story has described was possible. It is a gap that no legal system, no regulatory framework, and no international convention has succeeded in closing. The history of the Vatican Bank in the second half of the 20th century produced an empirical answer to the question that its legal architecture implicitly asks: what does a financial institution do when it operates without any external accountability? The answer is not that it inevitably becomes criminal. The Marcinkus era did not emerge from the IOR's legal structure automatically. It required specific individuals making specific decisions to deploy that structure for criminal purposes. But the answer is that the absence of accountability creates the conditions in which criminal deployment of institutional resources, once it begins, is extraordinarily difficult to stop, extraordinarily difficult to investigate, and extraordinarily difficult to prosecute, because the institutional architecture that should provide the mechanism for each of those responses is the same architecture that has been captured by the activity, requiring the response. The Vatican Bank was not uniquely vulnerable to this dynamic. Every institution operating without external accountability faces it. The specific and extraordinary feature of the Vatican Bank's case is the combination of factors that made the dynamic in this particular institution produce outcomes of this particular scale. The specific historical moment of post-war Italy, the specific individuals who identified and exploited the opportunity, the specific legal architecture that placed the institution entirely beyond the reach of the regulatory and judicial systems that were trying to investigate it, and the specific political network, P2, that provided the institutional buffer within those systems that allowed the operation to continue beyond the point at which it should have been stopped. Roberto Calvi's body was exhumed in 1998 for forensic examination. The examination produced findings consistent with murder. The murder trial produced acquittals. His remains were returned to his family. He is buried in Italy. Pope John Paul I was beatified by Pope Francis on September 4, 2022, 44 years after his death. Beatification is the third of 4 steps in the Catholic Church's formal process of canonization, the recognition of sainthood. It requires, among other things, the verification of a miracle attributed to the candidate's intercession. The Vatican announced that a miracle attributed to John Paul I's intercession had been verified. The details of the miracle were provided to the relevant ecclesiastical authorities. The cause of John Paul I's death was not re-examined as part of the beatification process. Lizio Gelli died on December 15, 2015, at the age of 96, in the villa at Arezzo, where his documents had been seized 34 years earlier. He had been convicted of multiple offences connected to P2's activities, including obstruction of justice in connection with the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, the deadliest terrorist attack in post-war Italian history, which killed 85 people and which subsequent investigation connected to a neo-fascist group operating within the P2 network. His sentences were variously served, appealed, reduced, and ultimately rendered largely symbolic by the combination of his age, the Italian appeals process, and the passage of time. He died in his home. Paul Marcinkus died on February 20, 2006, in Sun City, Arizona. He had spent his final years in the American retirement community in relative anonymity, giving occasional interviews in which he maintained that he had done nothing wrong at the Vatican Bank and that the investigations that had targeted him were products of political animosity rather than evidence. He received the last rites of the Catholic Church. He was buried with the honors appropriate to a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church, the rank he had held since 1969, bestowed upon him by the same pope whose confidence in his loyalty had placed him at the head of an institution whose resources he had subsequently helped direct into the hands of the Italian mafia, a Sicilian fraudster, and a Milanese banker who ended his life hanging from scaffolding over the Thames. The Vatican Bank continues to receive deposits, make transfers, and conduct financial operations in the currency of 135 nations through the international banking system. It continues to assert its sovereign immunity in response to requests for information from national regulatory and judicial authorities. It continues to be the only financial institution operating within the Western financial system that is not subject to the basic reporting and oversight requirements that every other participant in that system is required to meet as the price of access. The men who built the Vatican Syndicate are dead. The institution they used to build it is open for business. The Italian mafia, at the height of its power, controlled Sicily and influenced Rome. The Vatican Bank, at the height of its corruption, controlled a financial network connecting organized crime, intelligence services, and political influence across 3 continents, operated through a sovereign institution answering to no regulatory authority on earth. The mafia sent threatening letters with black handprints at the bottom. The Vatican sent letters of comfort on papal stationery. The difference was not the crime. The difference was the letterhead.